welcome to China EVs and More, where my co-host Lei Xing and I will go over the week's most important news coming out of the China EV, AV, and mobility sectors. We'll stop our chat at about the 1.5 hour mark, and we'll open the room up at the 40-minute mark to anyone who's keen to ask us any questions. One rule, we appreciate vigorous debate, but let's all be considerate and respectful to each other. What Lei and I discussed today is based on our opinions and should not be taken as investment advice. Even if it sounds like investment advice, it isn't. We encourage those who enjoy this room to please connect with us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, and to follow us on Twitter. And of course, tune in again next week. My name is Tu Li, and I'm the founder and managing director of Sino Auto Insights, a Beijing-based consultancy that helps organizations bring innovative and tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility markets. I write a free weekly newsletter that we pull many of our discussion topics from. You can sign up for it at Sino Auto Insights, which I encourage you all to do. Lei, can you please introduce yourself?
Good evening from my side. My name is Lei Xing, and I'm the former chief editor of China Auto Review, which published newsletters and a tabloid magazine in English focused exclusively on the Chinese auto market. I've spent most of the last 20 years on the ground in China covering the industry. I am now in the US working as an independent analyst, consultant, and still trying to keep tabs on the rapidly evolving market. This week, we're talking NIO Way to Norway and the May holiday. And we will probably have a shorter session today because it's been pretty slow relatively compared to weeks past. And due to the May holiday, which ran 5 days this year. It used to be, just a long weekend, but it was 5 days. So Neil, how about Tu? What are the highlights from your side?
So, before you explain kind of what you got from NIO Day, I just wrote down a few statistics that kind of stood out to me, right? The 9,000 employees in 40 countries, that's pretty substantial, although once they start manufacturing on their own, that number is going to balloon, right? I think 9,000 is pretty small for a manufacturing company. So, their entire balance sheet is going to change once they start bringing manufacturing in-house, which they're going to have to do eventually as they increase volume. I don't know if they want to get to the numbers they do, that outsourcing manufacturing is sustainable. I haven't really looked at it from a numbers standpoint that deeply, but it just seems that at a certain point, you should probably bring in manufacturing to gain more control of the process and costs. So the other things that I wrote down are for the ET7, 33 sensors. So there's going to be a lot of calculations, 1,016 tops. And so I think they're subtly saying that they're going to be the standard bearer for smart EVs in the premium and luxury sector. And, finally, 300,000 active users on the NIO app. That's pretty impressive, especially since they've only sold 102,000 cars. So the question that's hanging out there is, will it travel? Will the NIO app travel? And maybe that's why they picked Norway, because it's a smaller country and they can kind of test out new customer engagement strategies. But what did you think? And were you impressed?
Yeah, generally, I woke up really early this morning, 4 a.m., to watch the live stream. And I thought for a moment when I was watching it, it felt NIO as a brand felt a lot more international for some reason. Even, William, the CEO, he even spoke a few, phrases in English. So, and then I really thought this is some, for a startup brand and getting it onto the international stage and being a global brand. I really thought, wow, it really is a global brand. And also, I think what they hired, this guy, Marius, he's basically been at all the brands. Jaguar Land Rover, I looked him up on the LinkedIn. Volvo, right, for many years, basically in charge of these brands in Norway. So I think getting this guy on board is really quite important first step. I think what William mentioned in the media interview before the event was they only started preparing, they've been preparing for the international expansion, since the start. But for Norway, I think they started building up the team late last year. And this Norway entity was formed in March, officially formed in March. And then I think the other debate I think people are having is putting ES8 as the first model into Norway was a bit maybe surprising, considering the ES6 and the EC6 felt more, I guess, more appropriate for the market. But I think their strategy is to really have that premiumness and have their flagship model, the model that started it all, with a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack standard, have that model put into the market first. And William said this, one of the reasons. He said, the e-tron is the top selling model in Norway in 2020, nearly 10,000 units sold. And he said that was a big car. So ESA, he doesn't see why it can't do well. And Norway is not a market that's like other European markets where small hatchbacks and estates or wagons are popular, right? A lot of big cars are sold in Norway, and they like that car. So I think that might explain the reason.
I think it's important to give the audience an understanding of scale. So Norway buys about 200,000 cars a year. So the market is tiny compared to China, the EU, and the United States. But, again, it's their first foray into Europe. And I think they have a captive audience because Norway is very oil rich. So the Norwegian government is spending a lot of money to incent their citizens to purchase alternative energy vehicles. And so this could be their opportunity to really, really get grounded on branding and, customer engagement. And so Norway seems like a pretty safe place because the take rate on new car sales for EVs is close to 80 or 90%. So most new cars are now in Norway electric vehicles or battery electric vehicles. So to your point, and I think the expectation for the ES8 would be a bit lower from a sales volume standpoint. So if the e-tron can sell really well, and the e-tron is essentially a Q5 with a battery bolted on, as opposed to the ES8 being from the ground up designed as a battery electric vehicle, I think it'll be able to compete. And it should take some shine off of the e-tron here in China too, which if they're able to compete and sell at the same level or close to it in Norway against the e-tron, they could use that as market material for China. So, I thought that was a bit weird as well because the ES6 is the high runner and you would think that he would want some volume into Norway, but, they seem to be very careful and very measured on their strategy to enter the EU or to Norway at least, right? So
yeah, and a few words that come to mind were kind of, I guess, planting a seed. And NIO on their new website, I think they had 2 very short articles, and the key word in the titles of those articles was doorway. So doorway into Europe and planting a seed. So Norway is, it's a test ground, basically. And they don't expect the volumes. I think what they're trying to do is, this is really a copy and paste strategy. Everything that they're doing in China, they're bringing it over to Norway. And Norway, all the cars are imported, right? And I believe there's no import duties for cars. So they don't expect, any major volumes. I don't think, but it's also interesting that William did mention in one of the interviews that they expect a regional market volume to be, a good 50,000 a year and as much as 100,000. So it's kind of conflicting, but I think at the beginning they're starting delivery in September. So basically the last quarter, and, if they can do a few hundred units, that's pretty good. And also in terms of size, it's basically a couple of 2 or 3 provinces of China or 2 or 3 states here in the US. That's how big Norway is. Except it's a lot of, there's a lot of open space, mountainous, and the battery swapping, interestingly, they will make the swapping stations in China and ship it over. And the only thing they'll have to worry about is asset-based model, where in China they have this joint venture, right? And how the taxation works, that's another issue that they will have to work out, I think.
Well, we'll also see from a quality and reliability standpoint how well their vehicles and the batteries kind of manage the cold of Norway, right? Because I think that's one of the wild cards. I don't know how much testing they've done in cold weather, to be quite frank. And we know that at least I know anecdotally, and some Tesla owners on this call could probably confirm or deny this, that Tesla vehicles, some of the batteries in the wintertime, they go down by 20, 30%. So is that going to be an issue? Is that something they anticipate? Because that could increase service requests quite substantially. So there's just a lot of unknowns for them. And I think this is pretty smart because it gives them an opportunity to get into the rest of Scandinavia quite quickly. I would almost look at the EU as three separate regions, the UK separately. There's 2.5 million cars there. So once they gain some confidence in some parts of the EU, they could potentially enter the UK, but then they would need to start building a right-hand drive vehicle. And then, the rest of the EU where Germany and France are going to dominate. And so maybe they need to build up some small wins in order to gain some momentum to get into those countries where the volume is going to be driven by just a handful of countries, right? So, it'll be interesting to see what the domestic players, the European domestic players, how they react and how aggressive they are in competing directly against NIO, because I could see them succeeding in Norway, at least from a marketing standpoint, in the hundreds of cars sold, especially at the ES8 price point. But, does that open the doorway into selling a ton of ES6s and EC6s? Potentially, right?
Well, so far, they've only announced the ES8 and the ET7 being the next model. So no word on ES6 or EC6 yet. But I think another issue is the Mustang Mach-E just started deliveries in Norway. And I was reading this on Free Press. One of the owners that received delivery said, I don't want another Audi. I don't want another Tesla. I want something different. I guess that's a plus for NIO, right? NIO is something different. And I think they're really trying to drive that whole first premium ownership experience. So everything that's going on in China, right? The lifestyle, the app, the community, they're trying to, just bring that into Norway, but obviously with Norwegian characteristics, teams on the ground, right? And the general manager who knows the market.
The one thing that also stood out to me that was pretty apparent is they kind of washed the tie to China, with the exception of William speaking in Mandarin, obviously. If you saw the video without him speaking, you would think this is a Western style brand, right? So there's not going to be many other brands, Chinese brands, that can do that because, again, we're looking at 40 countries that are represented by NIO staff. So I'm thinking most other Chinese EV brands or even SOEs don't have that many nationalities represented in their company. So this is another advantage they're going to have over some of these other Chinese firms if those guys decide that they don't want to lean into the Chinese brand, the Chinese branding.
Also interesting, at the very beginning of the press conference, the first 10 minutes was basically William Li talking about the entire history of NIO. And he established right at the beginning that they wanted to be a global brand and how they had branches set up early on in Germany, right, Munich, in the UK. They had the ambition to even enter the US as far back as 2017. So it's been 4 years. So Norway is obviously the first.
That's a blessing in disguise.
Yeah.
That they delayed their entry into the United States. That's definitely a blessing in disguise.
Yeah.
So
again, this is, it's like they said, it's a doorway, it's planting a seed. They will have to tweak as it goes. But, putting that one NIO house right in the most prime location, that's been their strategy all along. And then if you saw that the 4 more they will open will only be NIO spaces, so the smaller venues with lesser investment. So just to establish that brand as a premium, brand, and their entire community based, and all the NIO Power, the Power Swap, Power Mobile, everything.
Yeah, we'll see in September. They need to start shipping, 30 days before?
Yeah, in the video, one of the videos that they had the guy who's responsible for the production of these vehicles, SOP will be in June, and then after which you'll start deliveries. It'll start transport, and then arrive, Norway by the end of the summer, I guess, and start deliveries.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we move on to the next topic.
Yeah, sure. So China had this too. You were among 230 million people who took trips during the May Day holiday. Any sights and sounds you want to share mobility-wise?
Yeah. So to your point, 230 million people traveled over, let's say, the May holiday, which is a 5 day holiday period. And so for scale, the United States is around 350 million people, 230 million people travel. And we're talking all over China, airplanes, trains, automobiles. So we ended up going to Shanghai for a day and spending the day in Shanghai before we headed off to Suzhou for 3 days because my wife had a half marathon to run in Suzhou on Wednesday. And so another statistic on May 1st, the actual Labor Day, Chinese railways hit an all time high with 18.8 million trips. Trip.com, which is the predominant travel website in China, reported that bookings over the 5 day holiday were up 30% from 2019 levels, so pre pandemic levels, up 30%. So to say the Chinese consumer is wanting to travel is quite an understatement. So just a brief kind of story about my trip. We got off to an early start. We left the house here at 6:30 for a 9 a.m. flight into Beijing from PEK, and the boys were pretty psyched. You know, no problems waking them up, and had to think back. Oh wow, they haven't been on a plane or really traveled for a year and a half, and normally we're going somewhere every quarter. You're probably remember that living here and being able to travel domestically and internationally, Lay. So they were pretty excited, and I finally realized, wow, it's been a while. So we made it to Shanghai without any issues, no delays on the flight. So you know that during its heyday, Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong flights from and to those three places are notoriously late. And we dropped off our luggage when we got to Shanghai at the hotel and then headed to Waitan, which is known to Westerners as the Bund. It's one of the prettiest skylines in the world. We walked around a bit with the boys and they took some pictures of the view and the skyline and the walkway. And it was getting crowded, but it wasn't like packed yet. So, but it was still early. So we had lunch on 3 on the Bund on the 7th floor on a terrace. Amazing view looking at the Pudong skyline. I showed the boys where I worked, and just the weather was great. The sun was out, and after lunch, we walked around a bit. Went to Nanjing Lu, or Nanjing Walking Street, and that's when it hit me. Like, oh man, this is China holiday. The number of people, the humanity was just like, oh shit. And so the military had to separate the people walking towards People's Square versus the people walking to the Bund, which was very, very organized. In the past, it was just random people walking all over the place, which made it a bit more hectic. And I wanted to buy some trainers because I'm going to try to get into better shape. So I wanted to go to the Nike store near People's Square to see if they had these shoes that I wanted. And of course, it took us 45 minutes to get to this Nike store, and they didn't have them in size. So we went back to the hotel. We checked in, and then we went to this area called Found 158 in Shanghai. It's a newer area, and it's an open air like food court. And so there's like 5, 6, 7 restaurants there. Hung out, met up with some friends, and there's also some clubs and so forth. For those that have never been to Shanghai or haven't been to Shanghai recently, I've been to a lot of cities and a lot of places, and Shanghai has this energy. It's one of the largest, top 3 cities in the world, and it's just an amazing, amazing city. The next day, we jumped on the Gaotie, or the high-speed rail, to Suzhou, a tier 2 city with 11 million people, and it's about 110 kilometers away from Shanghai, which is about 70 miles. And the one-way ticket, cost us 40 kwai, or for a second-class seat, which is still pretty nice. So it was like $7 to get from Shanghai to Suzhou going at 300 kilometers an hour. So pretty cheap. And then we got to Suzhou, and Suzhou is a smaller city, 11 million people, if you consider that small. And the old part of town has these canals, and so that's the very touristy area. And so we walked around that place, and it was a little bit crowded. The kids were a little antsy because it was so crowded, and they're 7 and 9, so they don't get to see over the crowd. And so I think that also created some anxiety. We were definitely holding their hands, although they're a little bit older. But yeah, the weather was okay. in Suzhou, but then came back. Everything's fine here except for last night. I'd mentioned this earlier before we started the show that there was another sandstorm last night. So for some reason this year, sandstorms are very, very prevalent in Beijing. So, but what do you remember and what do you miss about, being able to travel domestically, and what cities were your favorites in China when you were here?
Wow, that was fantastic. You're making me really drool here. The farthest trip I've made since I got here early last year was the last month, the 70-mile drive that I took from here to Boston to test the ID4. That was the longest trip I took. And it's even within the state. But mobility-wise, I remember I always liked traveling southward to the Zhejiang and Shanghai areas, because once you get there, everything is basically done on a high-speed rail. Like you can, purchase tickets on your phone and make an easy transfer if you have to do it. From Shanghai to Suzhou to Hangzhou to some other cities in the south and Nanjing. Especially when you have a flight canceled, you can pretty much book a high-speed rail ticket back to Beijing in 3.5 hours. I really like those. The flexibility and just the ease and convenience. But normally on holidays like this, we probably would stay in Beijing and just drive over to the Great Wall or, suburbs for sightseeing. But I mean, I've been dormant pretty much. When you talk about these things, it seems so far away. So,
Yeah,
I
I think
if I
most
had a
people.
chance to go back to it, I need to get used to it again.
Yeah, so my friends, and you know this, my friends have some cottages near the wall, and you drive for maybe an hour and 10 minutes, and you're literally 200, 300 meters from parts of the wall, and it's beautiful. And it's just a different place because Beijing is all hustle and bustle. And I will say this about Beijing: if you want culture, if you want history, tradition, you come to Beijing, there's plenty of that. And you go to Shanghai, not so much. But if you're looking for an LA plus New York City combined with great food, great nightlife, walkable city, Beijing is not as walkable as Shanghai. And, just amazing, amazing places, but totally different. New York versus LA, San Francisco versus LA, that's what you get. And I do want to say that Beijing people have a bit more soul than Shanghai, generally speaking. But yeah, so man, the I think what I get out of this is that the United States is going to explode with domestic travel once we've reached, or the United States has kind of reached herd immunity, because there's just going to be this desire to get out and be outside with other people, seeing things, feeling things, eating things. So, I'm hopeful for you guys to be able to do this in the next 3, 4, 5 months. So, if the Biden administration follows through and says by the 4th of July, we should be able to, or you should be able to barbecue. I think that's great. So there have been some more updates on the Tesla situation. So Lei, why don't you update us a little bit on what you're hearing and what you're seeing?
Well, this is referring back to the lady dancing on top of the Model 3 at the Shanghai Auto Show. Is that the lady is suing Tesla, China. And then somehow a person that I know who works for We Media, he's also involved, and he's suing Tesla China for defamation on this thing that basically Tesla China said, and that guy was involved in helping this lady to protest. So I don't know, it's still evolving, it's still transpiring, almost more than half a month after the show, So, and I think we're going to see Tesla numbers, if not today, maybe the weekend. I mean, today, China time, the CPCA is supposed to announce the April numbers. I don't think that will be affected. I think it'll still be strong. But let's see how, the May, June numbers, second quarter numbers, they're going to be affected by the chip shortage anyways, because the consensus is that the Q2 is actually going to be worse than Q1. So we'll see how this will affect not only Tesla, but just everybody else.
Well, it'll be interesting as well to see how they play that, right? Because internally they'll know how much, if there's a shortfall or slowdown in sales, how much was caused by the chip shortage versus how much demand has gone down, right? And then, one other thing I want to ask you is they had announced yesterday that they're creating a platform to allow customers to get their data back or have access to their own data. Is that what you're hearing as
Yeah,
well?
I just checked. This is only happening in North America for now, I think. So not sure what's going on in China, but this has been circulated also in the media in China. But this is only for North America. The EDR, event data recorder thing, it's like a black box, and you have access to the data, I guess. But I think the word that comes to mind is transparency and how they just abide by the local rules wherever you operate, and just the way they treat events and incidents, especially now that all the state media and the government has come out and sort of singled out Tesla.
Yeah, there was an article in Reuters that kind of updated everyone about how Tesla is going to bolster their PR team, their government relations team here, and then also participate in more of the government conferences and things like that. So I think they're coming around to being more receptive to customers and not being so combative against the powers that be here. So it'll be interesting to also see if they're allowing users in North America to access their own data. And this is probably a surprise to a lot of car makers, number one. And then number two, does this mean that the customers can ultimately download that data and sell it back to other entities? Because, I think there's advocates out there that believe that it's their data, they own it. You shouldn't profit off it unless I share in that profit or revenue. So, does that ultimately throw a monkey wrench in some of these car makers' abilities to create services based on the data that they collect off of these customers? So that's an open question. It's not something that we can answer today, but it's definitely something that is a curveball that Tesla threw.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. Lei and I thank you for tuning in. My name is Tu Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at Sino Auto Insight. That's SinoAutoInsight. You can find Lei on Twitter at LeiXing77. That's LEIXING77. If you wouldn't mind rating and or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you grab your podcast from, we'd appreciate that as well. Even better, if you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Please join us again next week as we track down all the latest news on China, EVs, and more.